Hello, my name is Connor Norris, and you are listening to Catholic versus Other.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, if you would please, who you are, what you believe, and why you believe it.
Well, my name's Connor. I am a Indo-European pagan of the Germanic branch. I came to my beliefs. It's hard to nail down exactly when and where it all happened, really, because in a sense, I feel like I was kind of born into this faith that I am in now. My father always raised me with the knowledge that our family name is derived from Norris or Northman. So I always kind of had that pride in my heritage just instilled in me. And my father told me the stories of the old Norse mythologies and whatnot. And I always was fascinated by mythology, that kind of thing. History has also always been my favorite subject, and I've always just kind of voraciously consumed anything related to that. So yeah, just anything mythological, heroes. These tales have always spoken to me on a deep level. But then even beyond that, I've always had a connection to that type of history, I suppose, ancient history especially. And it isn't not necessarily relating to just the Norse or Germanic pantheons. I mean, it could be Sumerian. I read the Epic of Gilgamesh when I was a kid. I really liked it. Obviously, Greco-Roman mythology, Hindu mythology. I'm actually still relatively new to Hindu mythology, but it's really fascinating. But it's funny, despite that, my family was nominally Christian. We were part of a non-denominational Protestant, typical American church, and we attended on Christmas, Easter, maybe every now and then. And actually, I definitely remember distinctly not liking going to church, really just because when you're a kid and you go to church, typically you get put into Sunday school. And I didn't really want to get put into Sunday school because that typically just meant that we would just be standing around singing Jesus rock songs and whatnot, which didn't particularly engage me. If anything, I was much more interested in actually going to the adult sermons. That would have been more up my alley. And in fact, every now and then I kind of got myself into the adult sermons because I like that a lot more. There was discussion of theology, liturgy. I guess they're not so much. Like I said, it was a Protestant American non-denominational church, so not particularly heavy on sacrament or ritual or anything like that. But at the very least, like I always liked hearing tales from the Bible and whatnot. Even beyond that, I was also my church was a private school as well, and so I feel like I grew up in the church with a degree of familiarity with Christianity. But I have to admit, I am somewhat envious, actually, of Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, especially like cradle Catholics, because I see in them they have such a rich history of tradition and the rites and the sacraments, and all of this is so present in their faith and in their lives, particularly, like I said, the cradle Catholics, who that's part of their identity growing up. I think that's fascinating, and in a way, I sort of wish that I had that. But then on another hand, I almost wonder if one can't consider me almost a cradle pagan, even just because I was born into this understanding that I am a Norseman, essentially. But yeah, that is essentially the summation of it.
What about your siblings? Do you have siblings, and what's their journey like, really briefly?
I have one sister, and she and I have been incredibly close all throughout our lives. It's been a little bit since I've spoken to her last. She's still in college right now, so she's often really busy. And we live in separate states and whatnot.
But is she Christian or pagan or what?
No, actually, I've had these discussions with her recently. I have to admit, I have somewhat turned your argumentation on her, in fact, in regard to having a backbone of theism, some belief in God, because otherwise there's no meaning to anything. You can't have a morality. You can't have any of the things that we take for granted. And I kind of turned that on her and put that to her. So that was interesting. So yeah, that's still she's still a nut that I'm trying to crack in that regard. But it's fun conversations and whatnot. What's interesting is she and I have always bonded over Lord of the Rings. And of course, J.R.R. Tolkien was a very, very devout Catholic. So I think that there's strands of theism that interest her, I think. She may just not know it yet.
Mm. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what distinguishes your particular brand of paganism from some of the other brands that are popular out there.
Yes, well, definitely within the quote unquote pagan community, and it's difficult to lump everybody together because there's so many different views. I mean, it is paganism, almost the name itself kind of denotes everything else, basically, as opposed to monotheism. So obviously, it's really tough to kind of nail down the group entirely because there are so many people who think of it in terms of archetypes. That's probably the most common view, is that in kind of a Jungian perspective, the archetype of, for instance, Wotan, Odin in the Norse pantheon. Jung discussed at length about Wotan as the archetype of the wandering mystic, the wisdom giver, the wisdom receiver, the that kind of character, and also the high king of the gods. That's Odin's role. So yeah, most people think of it in those terms, but they don't necessarily think that Odin truly is a being. They usually think that it's just sort of this, I don't know, vague animating source. And that's not to say that I don't believe that Odin can manifest as an archetype. I do think that that's the case, but that's only one small portion of the equation. I think it's very clear from looking at the actual historical documents that we have of the faith of pagans in pre-Christian Europe. We can tell that they did actually believe in their gods. There was none of this conception of the archetype as being the only case, or even worse yet, this idea that, oh, they're just like fun stories that you can read because you don't want to be a Christian, basically. I think that that's silly. I think people who hold on to those views are really, they're just atheists wearing a Mjolnir, wearing a hammer, because it's a trendy fashion statement, really. If that's the closest you take it, you're not really going that extra step. And obviously, you and I share the same critiques of atheism as sort of a dead worldview, a worldview that really can't go any further. So yeah, really anybody who holds on to paganism, but is also an atheistic pagan, I just don't see the point. You might as well just be, it's all just song and dance at that point if you don't believe in it.
Hmm. Not that you're an expert, but can you just talk from what you do know about the influence of Western philosophy on your brand of paganism, like Plato and the Stoics, and what has been picked up by the pagans, and particularly that branch that you belong to, please?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the Greek philosophers, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, all of that is definitely heavy embedded in the pagan revival community. Certainly, Plato and Aristotle have a rich history of being incorporated into Christian philosophy, certainly, and I think with good reason. But I also think there's no real reason that they can't be incorporated into pagan philosophy, especially considering the time in which Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle lived in. It seems obvious that those should be incorporated and looked to. And in fact, within the circles that I'm involved in, there is a heavily Neoplatonic trend, actually. There's a lot of that as well. So definitely there's a wealth of information to be tapped there. And I would even argue even Christian theologians and early church doctors. And I think that Aquinas is very valuable. I like natural theology. I think that a lot of that is applicable to a pagan mindset to an extent. So yeah, it's interesting. And then of course, the Eastern traditions do have a relevance to the modern resurgence of paganism. So I mentioned at the top of the interview that I'm an Indo-European pagan, and so the ancient Indo-Europeans are the ancestor group of all of the European people, but they were originally from all accounts like a hunter-gatherer civilization around Ukraine, that area, who domesticated horses, cows, and invented the chariot. And they moved from the Ukraine all the way across the Pontic Caspian steppe and the Eurasian steppe all the way to India. And so there's a lot of crossplay between there. And those historical peoples formulated the basis for all pagan religions, essentially. So you can find a lot of parallels, cognates with Roman paganism to Hinduism, in fact, Persian religions as well, to some extent Zoroastrianism, but more pre-Zoroastrian Persian religions, all of that, and of course Germanic paganism. So essentially, the real binding force in all of this is the Europeans, this ancient people who really set up all of the culture, religion, and social structures of Europe and all the way down to India. So because of that, there is a wealth of information that can be gleaned from the East, from Hinduism and thoughts like that, because that's the thing. We can sort of say that the connection to the past in Western paganism, at least, has been broken 2,000 years ago with the rise of Christianity, we could say. Whereas that same scenario did not happen in the East. It did not happen to Hinduism. Hinduism still has an unbroken tradition. And some people in our circles are talking about sort of tapping into the flame of the East to reignite the torch of the West. And that would be a way to rekindle the continuity of the tradition, essentially.
Yeah. One thing that I was thinking of is my own heritage. I did some DNA testing just to get a rough idea where my ancestors come from. And I wasn't terribly impressed, but I did it twice with two different companies, and they both said basically the same thing, which is the British Isles, England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Scandinavia. And so I think I am a Norseman. But there was a friend of mine who was ashamed to admit it, but he was listening secretly to I think it's called Red Ice Media. Have you heard about that?
Yes.
And I think he said that it's controversial because they do talk about white supremacy. I'm not a white supremacist. I think there's one race, the human race. So can you just talk about that sort of aspect of it? Is that something that's significant in the community or not at all?
I should clarify that I am not a white supremacist either whatsoever. I do not believe in any such thing like that. What I will say, though, is that there is, in my particular branch of paganism, there is certainly a strong emphasis on connecting to your own personal culture, and that it is essentially inauthentic to connect with another people's culture. And we don't want to deprive anybody else of their own heritage. We would definitely support anybody if there was anybody who was interested in their own heritage to certainly focus on that, because we actually believe that our ancestors are real. They watch us. They influence our lives. They matter. And if you were to turn your back on your own ancestors to worship somebody else's ancestral gods, that just seems like a huge betrayal to your own family. I definitely wouldn't support that.
Yeah. So can you just reconcile that thought with the thought that you just gave about tapping into the East and borrowing from their flame?
Well, that's the funny thing. So while we don't necessarily believe that one should wholly adopt, for instance, the Hindu pantheon necessarily, although certainly there are some individuals who are called to Hinduism who are effectively white. So there's really specific situations when tapping into the Hindu Eastern tradition is appropriate, and we definitely don't want to endorse syncretism, the matching up of two completely separate religious concepts or entities. Definitely that is frowned upon. But at the same time, the binding strand between Hinduism and Germanic paganism is this Indo-European connection, which it is shared. And I think that because of that interplay between the two sides, there's a lot that we can learn. There's a lot of gaps that we can fill in that were lost in our own faith in Germanic paganism just because of the ravaging of time and to some extent the conversion of Christianity to a large extent, I'll be honest, unfortunately. And that is definitely appropriate because at the end of the day, we are both Indo-European expressions. We're expressions of Indo-European gods, actually. For instance, I believe in a large swath of modern pagans believe, at least in the circles that I frequent, that, for instance, the god Shiva in Hinduism is in fact the same being as Odin in Germanic paganism. However, the gods choose to manifest themselves in different forms, specifically to different people, which is completely fine, and that's understandable. And far be it from us to defy the will of the gods. If the gods decided that that's how they wanted to manifest themselves to a given people, that's fine. That's good. But certainly we can notice the parallels between two gods and go, huh, that's really interesting. Maybe that can help inform our understanding of a given god, especially because in the West, in Western paganism, we are lacking in material, whereas, like I said, in the East, the material has just overflown. It's just constantly, and it never broke. It was an unbroken tradition.
So I don't know if you've listened to a lot of my episodes, so you might have listened to the Hindu episodes. I had a couple of
I
them,
did, yes.
and they did mention. I was quite surprised that there is a Shiva lingam that's being worshipped by the Muslims in Mecca. This is allegedly what's happening. Do you have any comment on that? And do you want to talk about that as an example of the Shiva lingam being worshipped by the Muslims?
Yeah, actually, it was interesting when I listened to that episode. I had to go, what, no way, and so I had to research it. And suffice it to say, I'm unconvinced, unfortunately. There are pictures supposedly of within the Kaaba of the Shiva lingam, but those photos seem to be not accurate at all. My understanding is and actually, I found the actual photos of within the Kaaba. Interestingly, they're on Google Maps. Believe it or not, I don't entirely know how they got that in there. Perhaps some people would claim conspiracy on this regard. I'm somewhat dubious of claims like that. It looked like it was inside the Kaaba to me. It was actually surprisingly plain looking inside. It wasn't really gaudy. It was kind of nice actually, kind of just quaint and nice inside. But there was no Shiva lingam that I had seen. I came across another argument that just Mecca itself forms a Shiva lingam, like the architecture, the structure, the way that it's laid out with the Kaaba in the center, and it's a big black box, and then there's the structures all around it. I saw, but I was kind of unconvinced. In fact, what's funny is somebody, that same article that I read also claimed that the Vatican was set up as a Shiva lingam as well. And it does look similar, like, yes, but I think that that's probably just because architecture is like that. And I don't know. I think that there's a reasonable explanation for that. That's not a strange conspiracy theory.
Okay. So another thing I want to touch on that's connected with Catholicism, Hinduism, and your paganism is the sort of parallels between the saints and the gods. Can you talk about that from your perspective?
Yeah, actually, that was definitely one thing when I was first getting into, I guess, and this was, gosh, when I was a kid, I had a conversation with my dad about how the conversion happened. And he explained to me, well, yeah, I mean, it makes sense that the saints would naturally arise rather, out of a polytheistic tradition, because when they were converting the pagan Romans, it made sense to go, oh yeah, you guys have gods of fertility or whatever, a god that does X, Y, and Z. Well, here's a saint that you can pray to get the same benefit, essentially. That makes a lot of sense to me. It just seems like a natural thing that you would kind of carry over to sort of make things more palatable. And I like the saints. I really like the saints. Saint George of England is a really fascinating, cool saint, and I like the tradition that arose around Saint George, Saint George's Day, and all of that. The East actually has a lot of really great and fascinating saints. Eastern Orthodoxy is very strong on the warrior saint motif. I think that that's really fascinating because the Germanic faiths get a fairly understandable reputation for being very warrior based. Certainly, when someone thinks of Germanic pagans, they think of the Vikings. So definitely the warrior saints of the East appeal to me in that regard, in the same way that St. George does, slaying a dragon. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. What do you think about the stories of the dragons? I recently came out as a young Earth creationist, right? Can you talk a little bit about dragons, dinosaurs, the age of the Earth, and what are your sort of creation stories? Can you talk about that from your pagan perspective?
Yeah, the dragons are another motif that reoccur very frequently in Indo-European tradition. The concept of the hero venturing out from his lands. Typically, he'll be a prince, and he's looking for glory. He's looking to save a princess. I mean, all of that. That whole motif is Indo-European, and the hero will go into a cave alone. He'll conquer the odds. He'll face the dragon, and he'll slay the dragon, get the princess. It's all this like very magical fairy tale-esque story, and that's very consistent throughout the tellings of the Indo-European myth base, from the East or West, doesn't matter. and dragon slaying, really a primordial force of chaos, and that occurs at Ragnarok. And so that's definitely a depiction of Thor. Thor, of course, is the son of Odin, so he, in his own right, is sort of a prince. And so yeah, he slays the serpent, even though he dies shortly thereafter. He valiantly sacrificed in Greek Roman mytho-religious corpus. So yeah, the dragons are really fascinating. Where they fit in, the theory that dragons are dinosaurs is somewhat appealing. I do like that, but at least my branch of paganism, or my circles, we definitely are very evidence-based. We're very scientific, actually. There's a lot of research and whatnot. And so by and large, we tend to be believers in evolution and whatnot. That seems to explain a lot of our history. So much so that yeah, we are actually our beliefs don't find anything incongruous with the idea that humans evolved from apes, essentially. We actually don't have a problem with that. Interestingly enough, there's actually a story in the Poetic Edda, which is probably the closest thing to scripture that we have as far as the Norse side goes, the Germanic side. There's a tale called the Rigsthula that describes the god Heimdall traveling Earth in early history of Earth and meeting various peoples, three couples. He meets three couples, actually, and he spends the night with each of these couples. And after he spends the night, several months later, the wife of the couple gives birth to a child, interestingly enough. So there's some questions, Heimdall himself, like sleeping with the wife, or was he just like giving them a blessing and stuff? It's left uncertain, but suffice it to say, that is actually where we trace the essence of our people from, interestingly enough. So because the god Heimdall was the progenitor of these three different individuals who then go on to father essentially the caste. Actually, that's the creation story of like there's the craftsman class, the warrior class, the king class, and in fact the servant class as well. That's the origin of that whole system. And so through Heimdall, we actually trace our lineage to the gods, interestingly enough. But there's really no way in which that goes against evolutionary biology or anything like that. In fact, if anything, it works in tandem with it.
You mentioned Heimdall. That brings to mind Ham, who is one of the three sons that got on the ark with Noah. Is there a flood myth in your mythology?
As far as I'm aware, there isn't at least one that's preserved in Norse mythology. But there certainly are flood myths in Greek. There's a major one in Hindu mythology, and yes, they all involve boats. Interestingly enough, it is fascinating. The flood myth archetype is a really interesting motif, and I am always fascinated by that. I want to know where the truth in that arises from. I am really interested in that for sure.
In my religion, we have cult, code, and creed. So you need to worship in a certain way, you need to behave in a certain way, and you need to believe certain things. And I could list the minimum to you, but it's a little bit long. I think your minimum requirements might be a little bit fewer. So perhaps you could take a stab at sort of naming them or summarizing them, at least the minimum requirements to be part of your particular branch of paganism.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that historically, what defined a pagan as a pagan was that they took part in the rites. It was never formalized in such a way. It was just part of who they were. It was just, oh, well, yeah, I'm from such and such tribe of such and such clan, what have you. That's just who I am. And so I perform the rites and we have our patron deity and whatnot. It's just a part of them. So in that regard, there's really no requirement. It's really just part of who you are and whether or not you choose to take part in the gatherings and the rituals and the sacraments and whatnot. Now, I guess I will specify that there's the poem, the Havamal, which is the words of the High One. And the poem is attributed to Odin himself, the king of the gods in our pantheon. And there's definitely a section where it's pretty clear advice. You would say it's he's laying out good ideas, good things to live by, and so one can extrapolate virtues and Aristotelian virtues, especially from that text. But they're definitely not requirements or commandments or anything like that. They're really just suggestions. They're ways of saying, hey, obviously Odin is the wisest of the gods. He knows everything. So you should probably listen to him because he's going to give good advice. So that's really the closest thing that we have to that, I would say. And I guess I should note that Hinduism has far more involved sort of codes like that. Probably just because it's well preserved. Like I said, it's unbroken. So they have more of that, and that's an aspect that we can certainly tap into to learn from and sort of adapt for our own purposes, I believe.
Now, what about the best case scenario versus the worst case scenario? As you know, as everyone knows, we have in the Catholic Church, we have extreme outcomes of heaven and hell. Those are the only two outcomes for any human being. And that's why we are a little bit anxious about making sure that everyone hears the good news and gets into the ark to be saved. So by contrast, how would you portray this sort of notion of best case scenario versus the worst case scenario within your worldview? Is there any difference of outcome?
Yes, actually, eschatology is a really hot topic right now in our circles. So it's commonly it's believed, at least in by lay people, and even by like the average supposed quote unquote pagan, that a pagan, a Norse pagan goes to one of two places. They either go to Valhalla or they go to Hell, spelled Hel, named after the goddess who runs Hell. Her name is also Hel. So you either go to Hel's domain or you go to Valhalla, which is Odin's domain. And Valhalla is reserved for the valiant dead, the people who die in battle, who fight the odds and overcome them, essentially. And then everybody else who dies, if they die of sickness or old age or whatnot, they all go to Hell. And Hell is just a sad, dreary place. It's dark, it's dank, it's a bummer, basically, to be in. And that is commonly understood as the two places that you go. However, that's not exactly true, because in reality, there are far more options. Each god essentially has their own hall in Hell. Hell itself is not actually a bad place to go. In fact, if anything, it's described as a neutral or good place. There is feasting to be had in the halls of Hell. It's not a terrible outcome, really. Now, yes, Valhalla or Valhall is a special place. It is an honor to be with Odin and feast and fight and drink and die and live again and whatnot, all of that. That's all awesome, and it's good for the people who get there, but that's a really, really small portion of people who are going to make it to Valhalla. And then on top of that, what's fascinating is the god Odin and the goddess Freya. There's a war between the two of them. Each of them come from a different, so essentially a race of gods. Freya comes from the Vanir, and Odin comes from the Aesir. And they have a war, and as a part of their truce agreement, when they come together and they form the pantheon, Odin and Freya negotiate that Freya gets to take one half of the valiant dead, the dead killed in battle, before Odin does, and then Odin gets the rest of the valiant dead. So the valiant dead may even end up going to Freya's hall. Folkvanger is her hall's name, and so it's not even as cut and dry there. So half of the valiant dead go to Freya's hall, and then half of the valiant dead go to Odin's hall, and then there's a ton of other gods, and so there's a ton of other halls in Hell that one can go to. So one could perhaps go to Thor's hall, which is probably a lot of feasting and drinking. Thor is a very jovial god. He's kind of the god of the people, so certainly a lot of people might go to his hall if they were warriors, but maybe they didn't die in battle, or they embodied Thor-like virtues. Or there's also the god Freyr's hall, brother to Freya. And he's commonly known as a fertility god, although he has his own warrior aspect to it. But he himself was very much like a god of the common man, a god of the farmer, and he was actually the patron god of the Swedes, incidentally. And so perhaps a lot of Swedes would go over to his hall, even. So yeah, there's really a multiplicity of halls that one could go to. However, I know that one thing that you're interested in is where did the bad people go? And to that, I have to say there's probably a couple places where they could go. Some people like to say that there's no concept of judgment in paganism, that even if you were a bad person and you did bad things, maybe you were lucky and you would still go to a good hall. However, there's sort of a disagreement with that. Some people are reading those sources and saying that, yeah, essentially morality kind of didn't matter. What mattered was how cool you were, basically, how metal you were, because then you'll go to Valhalla and stuff. Even if you were a bad person, if you killed someone in battle, like, you're still going to Valhalla. That doesn't seem to be the case. There's a quote from the Havamal, again, words of the High One, written by Odin, that goes, cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself shall die. But there's one thing that never dies, the deeds of a good man, or some call it the deeds of an honored man, or some people have stated that the better translation is the judgment of a man. And so that implies that there is a good and bad, there's a judging happening of souls. And that's really interesting because a lot of people base that Havamal passage, they view that as sort of a, well, if you die and you get told about your people sing songs about you and stuff, that's how you remain alive. And to an extent that I think that that's true. I think that our ancestors believed that if they had songs told about them, if they did great deeds, they would be remembered and they would live on in a hall somewhere in hell. But still, again, there's that portion that seems to imply judgment. That's a big question. So who is doing the judging? That is kind of tough to find in the Norse sources. I think that's somewhere where we can tap into the Greek and the Roman traditions to kind of figure out where that fits in, just because we don't have any material available that kind of elucidates on that subject as well as we would like. But yeah, that's really fascinating. And I guess what I should say is we do know that there are bad halls in hell, or really they're really outside of hell, and that would be Niflheim, which is the realm of cold, of suffering, really. And in some sources, it's described that that hall is, or that realm rather, is reserved for kinslayers, people who kill their family, people who betray people, liars, cheats, etc., etc. And in Niflheim, it's a place of primal ice and cold and essentially chaos. And the soul is chased by ravenous wolves for the rest of time. They never get away. And the best they can hope for is to eventually just fade out of existence and oblivion, essentially, is the best that they could possibly hope for. Maybe their soul will get recycled in some sort of reincarnation or whatnot. But yeah, so that's definitely a tormenting realm that one wouldn't want to go to. There's even a worse possible outcome, which is in Norse cosmology, there's what's known as the world tree or Yggdrasil, and that's the sort of the axis mundi of the universe, and there are different realms spread amongst the world tree's leaves and even under the world tree, under the roots. And at the bottom below the roots, there's a great giant dragon named Nidhogger who continually gnaws on the roots of the world tree. And some sources say that particularly evil souls will get put under the roots of the world tree, and then occasionally Nidhogger will gnaw on the soul of the evildoer for eternity. So that's a particularly bad outcome. So yeah, there are varying different bad places that one could potentially go to as punishment for misdeeds.
Interesting. Yeah, I asked the Hindus, and they had some sort of terrible place, but they weren't clear if it was permanent or not. So I couldn't get a straight answer there.
I should say that I don't know if it's permanent either. Actually, there is a sort of a belief in reincarnation in across all Indo-European faiths, but what matters is what is reincarnating, because I think that there's a lot of proof to say that the ancient pagans believed in the tripartite soul. And so, of course, the ego, the you part of your soul, that may not live on. That may ultimately fade away unless perhaps your descendants perform the rites and remember you in your name and whatnot, and that'll give you strength in the halls of hell. For instance, that's what I believe my Christian ancestors are in need of. Actually, I try to remember them because I know that they are in hell, and they're not doing bad, but they are in need of constant remembrance, and so I like to remember them in that regard, or even ancestors that I don't know the names of. Ancient ancestors. We always try to hold a horn and give a toast to the ancestors to sort of give them some metaphysical power in the afterlife, so that they can hold on to their essence. But there are other aspects that I think do sort of are sort of shed in the afterlife upon dying, and some of those aspects may be reincarnated in a future descendant or whatnot. Some of those aspects may simply fade away into the ether or something. And then There's also the idea that one's own descendants are have a piece of you in them. There's certainly a lot of that going on as well in the sources. So I think that that's something that can't be discounted as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering, did you have a chance to listen to Lincoln Cannon's interview? He's the transhumanist Mormon.
Oh, I did. Yes, I do remember that interview.
Is there any overlap with your worldview there?
We tend to be pretty skeptical of transhumanism, actually, or really just all technology in the modern world. Certainly, I myself am very steered towards the traditionalist side of things, so we're just skeptical of things like that.
Actually, I was thinking more of the Mormonist side that was overlapping because their God is not a transcendent God. Their God is a material being. He may be subtle, but he's material and he's subject to change. So I'm just wondering if you have something in common with that sort of perspective where God is sort of the best being, but he's not necessarily different in kind so much as a difference in degree when you compare with the other heroes of the ancient days.
I see. Okay. Interestingly, I can sort of speak to the Mormon side because a vast majority of my family is Mormon. Interestingly enough, so I'm somewhat familiar. Although I've never been as familiar as I'd like to be with that religion, but I do find it interesting. So yeah, I am aware that their view of God is a kind of a curious one. It seems more polytheistic. It seems more pagan for sure. I know that they might sort of chafe under that label, but I don't know. I suspect that they kind of came to that belief because they, like me, sort of felt that ancestral call to polytheism, that idea that there are a multiplicity of gods, and that if they are righteous, if they're good, they can join the gods in the afterlife, and it's essentially that their lives on Earth are meant to try to be more like the gods. I kind of feel like that might have been where they were coming from. But then on the other hand, there's a high degree of interesting similarities with Mormonism to Islam as well. So I don't know. It's kind of a weird mix of the different things. Mormonism is a strange beast. I like it though. I'm intrigued by it. And Mormons are great people. Again, I love my family. So yeah, I've always wanted to have more conversations with them about their theology. It's really fascinating for sure.
What do you think personally, and what does your circle think generally of St. Patrick? Is he a friend or a foe?
Unfortunately, most people definitely think of him as a foe. I try not to get involved in the anti-Christian polemic. A lot of people consider me soft for that reason, but the vast majority of my most recent ancestors were Christians. I don't have a problem with Christianity. I think that it's a valuable path. I think it's a viable path. Personally, I'm a perennialist. Interestingly, that's actually how I discovered your podcast. I was looking up Dr. James Cutzinger, and I stumbled across your interview with him. I liked Dr. Cutzinger. I think he does great work, and yeah, so I agree with him and the traditionalist school of thought, the Sophia Perennis school. I do believe that Christianity is a viable path up the summit of wisdom. So I don't like to be hard on it, but definitely within my circles, there's a lot of anti-Christian sentiment, unfortunately. And I suppose I can't necessarily blame them. I get it. To some extent, I feel like it's still holding on to that kind of teenage angst rebellion. They want to fight against their dad, basically, the man. And I go, no, it's not really about that. It's not about rebelling against your dad. It's about coming home to your people's true ancestral dad, coming home to Odin. I don't have a problem with the Christian God and Christian religion and whatnot, but I know that ultimately, from my reading of history, it seems like it isn't exactly the perfect faith for my people and for my children and my family. But it is a good faith, and I don't want to take that away from anybody, and I certainly wouldn't take that away from my own family. But going forward, I feel like it's good to reconnect to our pre-Christian traditions. But a lot of people don't really share that sentiment. Like I said, a lot of people are much harder on Christianity. So in that regard, yeah, St. Patrick is usually not looked upon very favorably.
Where does the god of monotheism fit into your pantheon, if at all?
That's an interesting question. I guess I would say that I would have to tap into Neoplatonism in that regard. Their concept of the one, of the monad, I think is an applicable concept, that there is this one wholeness to the universe from which the rest of reality flows, that all of existence flows from. And in Hinduism, actually, there's that concept as well of Brahma, is what it's called. And that's just Brahma is not really a person, although there is a manifestation later on in Hindu sources called Brahman that I think is kind of just a way to sort of get people to wrap their head around the idea of this like one supremely divine but not a being. It's very complicated and it's hard to kind of nail down, but I do think that that is the ultimate source of reality from which all of us flow. But that's not necessarily to say that there is no individuality. I certainly I believe that I exist and I believe you exist and the world exists. I don't believe that it's all just a dream or some concoction of a dream in the head of a god, at least in a meaningful way. I mean, the world is meaningful to me, at least, and I know that. But yeah, essentially, I think that that's where the monotheism can kind of come in. My disagreement with Christianity is just that I don't believe that Yahweh is that one God. I think that he is a God amongst many others, and I think that we have evidence that through Canaanite religion that Yahweh was one God, and so was El as well, another epithet of the Christian God. Certainly, they exist and they are gods, but I don't think that they are the one God. They are simply manifestations of the one in the same way of Plato's the one. And it makes sense that someone would go, well, what if this God was the best? And what if this God was the only God out there? I feel like that seems like a natural conclusion that one could potentially draw.
I was a pantheist for most of my life, most of my adult life, and I'm very sympathetic to pantheism. I think it's sort of like an unthinking form of solipsism. No offense intended to any pagans out there, but that's just how I see it. Because I think if you don't go into radical doubt, then you can bask in the overwhelming, delicious diversity of life. And if you look at the Hindu religion or if you look at a pagan religion, it's just so rich and it's so colorful and it's so sensual. It's all very entertaining. It's all very distracting, and it's comforting.
Definitely, yes. It's definitely preferable to the dark existential dread that solipsism would bring, I think. So yeah, for that reason, at the very least, I think that it just appeals to my heroic spirit, if that makes any sense. It's just so much more, yeah, like you said, colorful. It's so much more interesting. So even if I am just a dream in some god's head, so what? It doesn't make my adventure any less real.
What would you say to Nick Stumphauser? Because he's on a 1-year journey to challenge his atheism.
Well, from my perspective, I think that it's a bit ridiculous to just believe that my ancestors just imagined the gods. I think that seems silly. That they saw a bolt of lightning and went, gosh, that's kind of like this big blonde bearded guy with a hammer that's just pounding at a mountain. I like the leaps of logic that would take to get there seem preposterous. I don't think that that's the case. I think that there definitely is some essence. Now, that being said, does that mean that I believe that Thor truly is that as a being? Not necessarily. I think that that's just the best way that we as humans can understand him. But yeah, the idea that the gods are just imaginary, I think, is preposterous. And anybody who is struggling to come to a belief in the divine, I feel like, well, gosh, there's this great Hindu story where a king calls up his best advisor, his best wise man, and the king is struggling with atheism. He thinks he's an atheist, and so he tells his advisor, he goes, all right, I will give you my entire kingdom if you can show me where God is. And the advisor thinks about it for a moment, and then he looks at the king and he goes, well, I'll give you twice your kingdom if you can show me where God isn't. And I think that that's a really good parallel. I think that the world around us is so magnificent, so incredible, that it seems preposterous to suggest that some sort of divinity doesn't exist, even so much so that a pagan author by the name of Colin Cleary, he's very big on trying to reconnect people to their ancestral worldview, that the view that their ancestors had, essentially. And he describes this thought experiment where he draws a circle around a cigarette butt of all things, like the most mundane thing. And he draws a circle around the cigarette butt, and he just focuses on the cigarette butt. He meditates on the cigarette butt and imagines what all took to get that cigarette butt to that place, like from a chemical perspective, from like a human history perspective, from just like the individual, whoever it was, smoking the cigarette butt and discarding it on the ground. He focuses on that, and he uses that as a meditation tool to sort of awaken himself to the reality of the world that, gosh, everything seems so vastly improbable that it kind of begs the question, like, if there is no reason, then why continue on, I guess. Yeah, so that's my question to all atheists, really, is just, if you don't have a solid reason for existing, if you don't have something that binds you to reality, if you don't have anything that gives you morality, ethics, virtues, what are you doing here, I guess?
Mm. What about a Sabbath? Do you have a Sabbath day, a special day of the week?
Wednesday is probably the closest thing to a holy day. All of the days of the week, of course, are named after the gods. So, for instance, Tuesday is named after the god Tyr, the god of justice, the god of law and order. Wednesday is named after Odin. Woden's Day is the origin of Wednesday. Thursday is, of course, Thor's Day. So, yeah, it goes on and on. So, but yeah, because Odin is the chief god of our pantheon, he is the high king of our religion. Probably Wednesday would be the closest. And in fact, every I guess I should say that the ninth of every month, because nine is also a very significant number in Germanic paganism. Nine is the number of completion. There are 9 realms in the universe of Yggdrasil, the world tree. The god Heimdall is born of 9 different women. Interestingly enough, how that happens, that's a mystery. But yeah, suffice it to say, 9 is an important number. And so the ninth day of every month, we do what's known as Odin World Prayer Day, where we all raise a horn to Odin, and we give him our metaphysical power, what little we can offer him. He is a god and we're just mortal people, but we do have a little bit of his divine essence, and so we give that up to him to strengthen him so that he can essentially help the reemergence of the pagan faith amongst our people. So yeah, Wednesday and the ninth of every month is the closest thing to a Sabbath, I guess, we have. And then sprinkled in there, we also have like days of remembrances for great heroes, in addition to typical holidays like Yule, Easter for Easter, things like that.
Tomorrow I'm going to interview an atheistic Satanist, but I've interviewed 2 theistic Satanists. They believe in many gods. I'm wondering, what is the pagan perspective on theistic Satanism?
My personal outlook on Satanism is, again, that it's just kind of a rebellious thing that people do to not be Christian. And I think that they're coming at it kind of inauthentically. I don't know if somebody is a Satanist, my question would be, okay, so on what literature are you basing your religion, or what historical worship of Satan do you have to look to give you legitimacy? I can't really find that. Unless you were worshiping, like, say, Prometheus, who is the fire bringer. And so some people make parallels to Lucifer, the light bringer, to Prometheus. And unless you were willing to go that way with it, I guess I could kind of understand it a little bit more. But otherwise, if you're going, oh, yeah, in the Bible, whenever it talks about Satan or Lucifer, I go, yeah, that's the cool guy that I want. He's the rebel, he's the guy I want to worship. I'm like, what does he do for you, though? Like, there's no historical worship of Satan, really. Like, not that we know of, to whatever effect that somebody is worshiping Satan. I guess in Catholic terms, they're worshiping pagan gods, right? So then it's sort of like, well, why don't you just become a pagan? Then I don't understand. It's very strange. Or like worship Moloch or Baal or something. And so in that same vein of thought, I guess, atheistic Satanism, I don't really know. That's almost like you wanted the best of both worlds, I guess you could say. You wanted to be both an atheist and be as edgy and radical as you could possibly be. I'm thankful that I never went through a atheistic Satanist phase in my life. I know you did.
Well, it's pure childishness and selfishness and rebellion, like you said, so I don't think there's much more to it than that. But I am being summoned by my wife, so I'm going to have to wrap this up. It has been fascinating talking with you. And I do like my guest to leave a little positive message at the end, just something nice for the listener, whoever they might be. So what do you think you might be able to say to anyone that's out there listening now?
Western people as a whole, the European people of the world, we have lost our soul. In saying that, I'm quoting the founder of the Austin True Folk Assembly, Stephen McNallen, a man that I have personally met now and who is really an incredible individual. But he has this parable that he tells of in Aboriginal societies, for instance, in Australia, there's this concept that a person's soul can go on walkabout. A person's soul can leave them. And the suffering that the individual has without his soul is sickness, it's sadness, disease, all bad things. And what's required is for a shaman to come and have a metaphysical experience, astral project himself into the other world and find that lost soul and grab that lost soul and put it back in the body. And then miraculously, the individual is cured. The individual is back to the world. And I think that that is what has happened collectively to the Western people. I think we have lost our soul. We have fallen into nihilism and materialism, but we can come out the other side if we only look back to our own history, our own traditions, our own ancestors, our own people. If we can just rekindle that spirit that our own ancestors had, it'll make the world a better place for everybody. I think that that's a necessary thing that does need to happen. And what I would say is it is possible to do that. It's not even really that hard. It does require a bit of research. Oftentimes, paganism, Asatru, Odinism, what have you, it's kind of known as the religion with homework. And to some extent, that is true. But if you're willing to put in the effort to just look to your own rich history, I think that you'll find something that resonates with you on a deep, fundamental level that you didn't even realize you were looking for.
If you like your worldview, if you think it's swell, if you got some questions, ask me and I'll tell. All you got to do is ask. All you got to do is ask.